Good morning, students of British and American culture. We have a large task ahead of us, as usual. We're moving into the 10th week of class, it looks like. We are making great progress. This is probably the most material and the fastest I've gone through. The lectures have been big, I know you realize that. But we are now finally in the 20th century, so today I want to talk about this stuff as efficiently as possible because there's so much to talk about. Some of these lectures are going to overlap chronologically, so this has already started to happen, when I talk about the English Civil War and then we go over to America and things are happening at the same time as the previous lecture. So don't be surprised if things cross over a little bit. Now, today, the title of Chapter 7 is 20th Century Boy. That is a song that I like to sing in the Norebang by T-Rex. So if you want to listen to it, it'll probably make you laugh because it's not your generation, but it's some good heartfelt rock and roll, and it's a fun song to sing if you know the lyrics in a singing room. So that's why it's called 20th Century Boy, because I like that T-Rex song, and it is the 20th century. We're not just talking about boys, we're talking about boys and girls. Right before we start, at the end of Chapter 6, there was quite a lot of detail there, which I skipped over because we were running short of time last week, but I want to quickly draw your attention to it. I did include particular Native American tribes, and there's descriptions of what happened to them there, which I didn't go into enough detail in lecture, but I would like you to read from page 168 to the end of the chapter on 179, because that's a significant chunk of the textbook. And the reason I put it there is because a lot of these people are not well known in Korea or in other countries, but they should be. There are certain people that have faded, out of memory, but they've gotten their place in history, which they deserve, whether they were victorious or defeated or existed thousands of years ago or not. And some of these Native people do deserve that kind of recognition, that they were huge contributors to not only the formation of the nations now, but that they had a period where they were a very influential part of human culture. So typical examples are, for example, the Aztecs. The Aztecs as a people and an empire don't really exist anymore. There's Mexico, but you can't talk about Mexico without talking about the Aztecs. And you can't really talk about the Roman Empire without talking about the Carthaginians or the Parthians or the Scythians. There's all these, the Germans, the Gauls. Germania is something that came later. It's just their name for the people. But we have names for those groups, and people study them because they changed the culture of the people that took their place. So you'd be surprised at how much of Native culture especially influenced the Americans to begin with. And I'll just go back again to what happened last week. When I talk about Paul Bunyan and I talk about Davy Crockett, these people, they were European and they carried guns around and they lived in, Western-style housing and ate food the way Westerners did. But their ancestors, whether they were real or not, because Paul Bunyan's not real, but Davy Crockett's ancestors, they acquired their skills, the hunting and the behavior, the tracking, planting corn, learning about geography, respecting nature in some cases, being fierce fighters. A lot of the Native people were great warriors, and they learned a lot by learning directly from them, by being taught, but also by being in contact with them, following them, watching them, and fighting against them. The amount of influence in American culture that the Native people had is enormous, and people just overlook it like it's not there. Anytime you see one of those attack helicopters in a movie, that attack helicopter, its name is an Apache. The reason it's an Apache is because an Apache warrior was a stealthy, lethal, dangerous, quick, skilled opponent. A weapon, one Apache warrior could be as dangerous as multiple other people. And especially if they were in the mountains or the desert, you wouldn't be able to find them. So a camouflaged helicopter with all these weapons that became a really, important part of the American military. There's a reason why it's called an Apache attack helicopter, because the Apache were great fighters. So you can look through here. I want you to just look at each description and just kind of focus on the main ideas. Like the Iroquois were a conglomeration of tribes that got stronger because they were allies with the English, for example, and they lived in long houses. The Algonquin were friends with the French, and they fought against the Iroquois, and they taught my ancestors and the French especially how to make maple syrup. The Apache were fierce trackers and warriors. The Sioux lived in the plains, and so on. There's a group of them, and then there's the Trail of Tears was a famous event where the native people in the southeast were forced to leave their land, and they moved them hundreds of miles west towards the Mississippi, where they could just relocate them, and their displacement represented, the surrender of their traditional land, and they had to go in a territory with other native people that didn't want them there. So they're basically being marched in exile into an unknown land where they wouldn't have any of the things that they had for thousands of years in their homeland. So that event is called the Trail of Tears, which the American government, the American people, and the Canadian people all have to accept as part of the guilt we carry for our historical behavior. Also on the very last page, it's quite small so you can't see perfectly, but I think I will try and find a graphic. I don't think I did include one. It would be better if you could see. I'll see if I can find it on the internet, this picture, so you can see it on the website in its higher resolution in color. But if you look at it, the thing that is remarkable about this map is there's about 200 different names on it, and they're not American Indians or Native people or Amerindians or whatever. They each have their own names, and some of the more famous tribes there you can see the Pawnee and the Sioux and the Cherokee and the Apache, and those are the bigger names. The Blackfoot and the Cree and the Algonquin, but there's hundreds of names there, and those are all different tribes of people. They all have different cultures. Now, that brings us up to the end of the century in the 1890s. Basically, the entire expanse of the continent had been explored and was beginning to be sectioned off into states or territories, so there wasn't any more space to expand. So America was taking shape as it was now. Alaska had been purchased in 1867. Louisiana far before that. California had been developed. So we're talking about America looking the way it does now. The border with Canada is fixed. As you come forward, you've got this big monster, network collection of states federalized into this big, gigantic country, roughly the same size as China, right? And this is the America we know today. So what happens when we start to see this take shape? Well, we're saying that the Americans were isolationists, but they weren't, in a sense that, I hear professors that I respect talk about this term very loosely, and I'm always surprised because they're very careful about a lot of things they say. But was America isolationist? No, I don't think they were. They just didn't like to intervene or participate in other people's business. And they were too busy expanding within this, unlimited almost territory. So they were just non-interventionists. That's a much better way of saying it. They didn't go into other people's business, but they had business going on at home. They were fighting against the natives and the Mexicans and the Spanish and whoever had territory around them. They were fighting and they were expanding. So you can't say they're not expansionists. They just had territory that, according to manifest destiny, they thought it already belonged to them. So it was their duty to expand all the way to California, all the way to the West Coast, right? That was where that long belonged to them. It wasn't in their possession, but it belonged to them in the future sense, the future tense and the future sense. They wanted all that land, and they felt it was, so they were basically doing some sort of offensive expansionist behavior, but they considered it already theirs. So it's almost like defending territory that you don't own yet. I know this is, it's part of the contradiction, remember? I said, America is full of contradictions. They love to fight themselves. So there's some people that don't think they should take the territory from the natives, and they don't think they should race to the ocean, and they think, going for gold in California is nuts. But then there's a huge amount of the population that's just, they're looking westward constantly for various reasons, and they believe that land doesn't belong to anybody important. So what they're doing is laying claim to something that's either it's already theirs, with their religious point of view, or they think that it's there to be claimed, one or the other. So that's what happens. The frontier closes. They say, all right, the whole thing's ours. But now what? Well, it's not a coincidence that in the 1890s, the Spanish-American War happens. They fight in Cuba, and they help the Cubans gain their independence from Spain. And then they go all the way over to the Pacific, and then they have a war with Spain, and they just crush. Spain doesn't have a very good navy. It's all falling apart, and the brand new American, upgraded, up-to-date, well-equipped ships just blast the crap out of the Spanish ships, and they don't really have a chance. I think one American dies by accident, and the entire Spanish fleet in the Philippines gets ripped to pieces and surrenders. They treat them with a lot of respect, obviously, because Spain was a superpower, but this is one of the last nails in the coffin, as the Spanish government doesn't have enough money to support its territories overseas, and the Spanish admiral, who seems to be a very brave and capable soldier, actually, he fights knowing that his ships are almost sinking, and he doesn't have enough cannonballs or training, or the ships are not in good condition. They haven't been repaired, and the technology is lagging behind. But he fights anyway. So it's this moment of clarity about the transition of the world order. Spain is out, America is in, and that's how the Spanish-American War goes. And the Americans stay in the Philippines, as you are probably aware. Lots of Filipinos speak English quite well, but they have a strong Spanish influence too, because the Spanish were there for hundreds of years. So you got the Spanish Catholic influence on the Philippines, and then a lot of them speak English quite well, and they like American culture also, because the Americans were there from the Spanish-American War right up until through World War II, and that's where they fought some of the wars, some of the battles against Japan. Some of the famous ones happened in the Philippines. Okay, so that brings us to here, American expansionism. At this point in the early 1900s, the Americans are going to hesitate still to just go into wars with anybody, but they are fighting wars continuously. From 1776, there's almost no break. They fight against natives, they fight against Mexicans, they fight against themselves, they fight against the Spanish, and then they will hesitate to fight other wars with other people, but only briefly. And as soon as they feel like American interests are threatened, and now American interests don't just include America, the continent, and America, the culture and economy that's located on the East Coast. Now it includes the area. Now they're an ocean power too. So it includes, for example, Cuba. It includes the Caribbean. They don't want anybody in there who has a powerful army. They don't want anybody too close to the Pacific Ocean. And if anybody they trade with gets damaged to the point that it affects the American way of life, then they're potentially going to go in after those people too. That's not something, like I said, that Washington wanted. George Washington wanted America to be neutral, not to have other powerful allies, that if that ally went to war with somebody, like if the United Kingdom went to war with Russia, that America would have to go into war against Russia too. He didn't want that. He thought it was much better to stay distant from those conflicts and then just avoid war with foreign powers altogether. If you got involved diplomatically with European politics, there would, of course, eventually somebody would start a fight with somebody else, and then you'd be drawn into it. And that's what he didn't want to happen. But American expansionism is happening because they are flexing their muscles and they are increasing the size of the Navy. Theodore Roosevelt is the famous president. He's in Mount Rushmore. He's got the glasses, and he helps make the settlement between the Russian Empire and the Japanese Empire in 1905 when they have the Russo-Japanese War. He gets a Nobel Peace Prize for brokering that settlement between those two empires. And it's because the United States is being involved in Asia now. They're not a colonial power, but they're there, and they're expecting Japan and China and other countries to trade. They want them to open up their countries and they want to work with them economically, but some of these countries don't want to. And so this is causing them to flex their muscles a little bit, and that's how Japan gets really transformed into an industrial power, is that, you know, the Americans kind of steam in there with a ship in the mid-19th century, late 19th century, and they point the guns at the city and say, you trade with us or we'll blow you up. And there's not really anything the Japanese can do. So then they decide that they're going to turn themselves into an industrial military power too. And eventually that leads them on the road to conflict. So this muscular foreign policy is being developed. And when World War I occurs, this thing we call the seminal tragedy, because it's such a horrible experience that's nothing like it is ever happened in human history. You get this is the result, is that the Americans at the end of the war end up participating, but they are trying to avoid it at all costs at first. So let me talk about World War I, and that'll be it. We'll save the rest of our material for lecture number 2 after today. So World War I is one of my favorite things to study in the whole world. There's so much to it. First of all, this is not gonna, our textbook's not gonna help a whole lot because I don't have this section in the textbook, so you can just put it down and just say we're at the beginning of chapter 7, but you're gonna have to listen to me for a bit because this material is not included in writing. So I'll put a little bit of a summary up on the website too. So basically World War I, before World War I, there's this network of alliances that are starting to form. And it's a dangerous one because it's certainly, there's always alliances, but you end up essentially with 3 empires on one side and 2 on the other in every case, and that is supposed to deter 2 of them from starting a fight, right? But the way these things are arranged makes pretty much all of the powers uncomfortable. So instead of everybody relaxing and being like, well, France isn't going to go to war because of Germany, and Germany's not going to go to war because of Russia, and Russia's not, instead of that happening, the opposite happens, where everybody thinks if one person goes to war, everybody's going to go to war. So it's pretty much like there's a ticking time bomb there, and it's like people are going to arm, and it's going to take a certain amount of months for them to do it, or days, right? And like as soon as one country starts getting its soldiers equipped and its weapons ready, it's like 30 days from now, there's going to be 1 million soldiers ready to go, right? And if the other country doesn't start arming and doesn't prepare their 1 million soldiers, it's going to be too late. So it's almost like they have these, Dan Carlin described it, at least. I'm not sure where he got it from, but I heard him describe it as a ticking time bomb, right? As soon as it's like a doomsday device. It's like you switch it on, and once you switch it on, it can't be stopped, right? It's basically like, okay, we're going to war, let's do it. 30 days from now, there's going to be 1 million soldiers on your border. If you're not ready, we're taking over your country. So you've got this sort of all these alliance networks and everybody's connected to each other. But the big countries are aware that what's going to happen is going to be a pretty horrible war, probably the worst that's ever been, has ever occurred in human history, because the nature of war has changed. They have huge bombs and guns. They're more accurate, they shoot farther, they shoot heavier shells and higher explosives. They have poison gas. They have machine guns. They have all these killing machines that they've made in factories. So instead of being able to kill 1 or 2 people with a gun, you can kill 100 at a time. And you can, instead of killing 1 or 2 every 5 minutes, you can kill 100 every minute. So the amount of death and damage is just going to go up 10 times or 100 times in some cases. It's just not going to be the same kind of warfare. But they still have all these theories, and none of it, a lot of it has been tested. So some of the generals and countries think that if they're very quick, and they knock out another country first, it'll actually be better. If they use the technology and their overwhelming power, and they crush the other country in a few days, there'll be less death. But if they fight, a traditional war where they fight each other over days and maneuver all over the place, that will be how all the damage occurs. So, the Germans, they come up with this thing called the Schlieffen. This is why German's tough. Too many consonants. Schlieffen plan. That's named after Schlieffen. And basically it's the German army, just a huge amount of the German army just attacks through Belgium and overwhelms the French army, and they take Paris, and then the French surrender, and then they can fight Russia on the other side. That's their idea, because they have Russia on one side and France on the other. So anyway, what ends up happening is not that Germany and France start a war directly, but what happens is in Serbia, there is an Austrian prince, Austro-Hungarian prince named Franz Ferdinand, he's the Archduke of Austria, and he's in Sarajevo. He's doing a tour for on a special event. He's doing a tour in a car, and a young Serbian rebel named Gabriel Princip shoots him and his wife and kills them in their open-top car. And as a result, Austria, the Austrian Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, they declare war on Serbia. But Serbia has got some sort of alliance connection with Russia. Russia's promised to protect their interest, even though they're part of the Austrian Empire. Culturally, linguistically, and ethnically and politically, they're connected to Russia. So the Russians say, don't attack them. If you attack them, Austria, we'll attack you. But Austria says, it's not your business. They're part of our empire. We're going to crush them. So Austria starts fighting Serbia, and Russia says, we're going to fight Austria. Austria is allied with Germany, so Austria says, if you're going to fight us, then Germany's going to fight you too. So Germany says, Russia, don't do that, or we're going to fight too. Of course, Russia starts building up its military. The time bomb starts, the doomsday device, and so Germany gets ready. And then, of course, when Germany gets ready, France says, well, if you do that, then we're going to help. We're going to help Russia. So now we got France going to fight Germany because of Russia. And then Germany goes into Belgium, and Belgium is, guaranteed neutral by the United Kingdom. So the United Kingdom says, Germany, if you go into Belgium, we're going to fight you too. And they go into Belgium, and then the United Kingdom decides to get in too. So there you go. That's complicated enough. You don't need to know that for the exam. Just need to know it's complicated. And there's lots of countries that jump in. Turkey ends up jumping in because Germany asked them to fight. They're going to have interests in fighting against people in France, and the British Empire is constantly harassing the Turkish down in the ocean. So Turkey ends up jumping in too. I'm missing people. This is how complicated it is. But you might look at it like as a domino effect. So when one country falls down, it knocks all of these other countries in, and it becomes a huge conflict. So remember that. It's very complicated. That's how it starts. The main thing about World War I that I do want you to realize, though, the most important thing for our purposes is how American and British culture changes. So, I want to read one. I want to read one really famous quote. So, one of the people involved with the start of World War I, his name was Edward Grey, Sir Edward Grey, and he made a speech to Parliament about this. But he supposedly remarked, as he was looking out the window from Parliament towards London one evening, he made a famous remark, and it seems very accurate in retrospect of what happened to the civilization of Europe during this conflict. So he looked out at the city of London. He said, "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." So the lights, this is the way it should be. We have a high civilization. We have industry, and we have luxuries, and we have our lifestyle, and the lights are going off, and it looks nice. But tonight, those lights are going to be extinguished by war and death and disruptive behavior. And he was right, because World War I didn't really end. It did end temporarily, but it ended in unsatisfactory peace. So we ended up with a really indignant, angry, suffering Germany for 20 years until Hitler came along and focused that energy into the Nazi state, which was an even worse disaster. So he was right. An entire generation loses all the things that they had. The economic damage, the physical damage, the damage to health and hope, and everything that represents the catastrophe. And that's why it's called the seminal tragedy. So the things that you can say about that, you can say it was just a disaster for everything, but this is kind of like the Black Death. Whenever we talk about the Black Death, you remember, you can look at the Black Death and say the best way to look at it is it's a horrible tragedy. But some of the effects that come out of it do have these benefits for human society. You can't take away from how horrible it is, just like World War I. But then you look at certain things and you see, well, this is humanity developing, because all the countries are fighting. It's total war. All the countries are putting all of their resources and all of their effort, their energy into it, so it's a fight to the death. And when they do that, they push themselves to do things like develop airplanes, right? At the beginning of World War I, we just got these airplanes that are made of, wood and paper and crash easily. At the end of World War I, you have fighter planes where people are not just shooting at each other with guns or waving at each other, but you have airplanes where there's a mounted machine gun on the front and they're doing dogfights and they're following each other. That's the difference. It's like, at the beginning, it's like, hello, I'm in a hot air balloon, shoot me out of the sky with a blowgun. And at the end, you have airplanes. At the beginning, you have people wearing uniforms that are red with white feathers on the top and bright blue, collars and stuff like that. It's like, shoot me, please. I'm a big bullseye. And then at the end, you have these people sneaking around with metal helmets and gray and brown and camouflage, and they're not walking in straight lines like this. They're moving in like firing teams and stuff, like in groups, and they're moving around obstacles. You have all kinds of things like, the bombs and the calculations, the ships shooting so far that you can't even see the ship on the other side. You got to calculate the curve of the Earth in order to hit somebody. And you have things like guns so powerful. The Big Bertha is a gun that the Germans make, and it's so big that you need to move it on a train track, and it shoots a shell so high that it goes into outer space, and it takes 2 minutes to come down, and it's the size of a car, and then it hits the street in Paris and kills people. These kind of things are technology advancing, and they allow us, like rocketry and space flight and traveling, transportation. Tanks get invented in World War I. You see cars and stuff everywhere. There's cars being pulled by horses, carts and horses moving everything. And then shortly after, there were cars already, but they weren't really for regular people. They were just for rich people. After World War I, you have mass production of cars. People start getting automobiles, not just, the richest person in the city, but everybody starts driving, and there starts to be roads that are developed for the cars, and processing plants and repairmen and all that kind of stuff. It's just, you can look at World War I, and we talk the main theme of the class, evolution and revolution. You can look at World War I and you can say, British culture was like this before, and British culture was like that after. And one of the things that makes it so shocking for British people is the fact that the British Empire gets to its maximum size at 1905, but the war is so expensive and it costs so much in life and resources and money that by the end of it, there's a lot of stress on all of the parts of the British Empire, right? It's really expensive and difficult for them, this tiny island, to keep everything, under, to organize and control and supply and communicate to all of its far-flung territories. So you can see that this World War, in some ways, World War I was the thing that just made it clear that the British Empire was not going to work anymore. That the clock was ticking. It was still gigantic and it had most of its parts, but that those parts were not going to stay together, and there was nothing that the United Kingdom could do about it. So one of the things that happened was the cost itself. Basically, America, lucky for them, they avoided most of the war. They only came in at the very end of it. The last year of the war, they sent their help to fight against Germany. And that was kind of reluctantly. But then, again, this is the showing their muscles. And they came in there and they helped seal the deal for the Central Powers. And in doing that, they participated in the war by producing all the ordnance and all the equipment and all the resources for the British. So the British paid for it. So you can just imagine, for the first 4 years of the war, basically, the British Empire was the one funding it. They were giving the French money too, and the Russians money too, because they were the wealthy ones. This is one of the great advantages that the Allies had, is that they had more money than Germany or Austria or Turkey. But all that money is going to the United States. So you can just imagine a great big vacuum over top of London, the financial center of the world, the biggest city in the world, just sucking money up and just dumping it in New York. And essentially that happened. It was one of the biggest transfers of wealth in the history of the world. There was some. I'm not going to get statistics right, so I shouldn't use them. But the figure that I recall is at the war, as the war got going, the British Empire was spending $75 million a day. And that's in 1910 money. So $75 million is still quite a lot of money today, right? Because you're talking about, a billion, more than $1 billion a month over an entire war. But it's more than that because of inflation. So you're talking about billions of dollars a month without stopping for the entire thing. And they did not really have the budget for that. So the wealth is just being sucked up and sent in various forms over to New York City. And by the middle of the 20th century, New York City is the financial center of the world, not London. And its population is larger. And the influence of the Americans, they are already kind of slowly crossing, but that's what happens. The Americans, it becomes the decline of the British influence and the rise of the American influence. And those are two of the major things that happen that are important for us to study in terms of the effect of World War I on British and American culture. And we'll talk about this more in part 2. So we'll leave it there since we still have more to say. And keep in mind, remember, you have an assignment that's due next week. It's not this week, it's next week. So you can start working on that, and I will talk to you again in a couple days. Thank you for listening. Have a good day.